Hey folks, today we're talking mitochondria, we're talking cell danger response, we're talking about the root cause of disease, and we're doing all that with my guest, who is Dr. John Kim, Pharm.D. On Instagram, he is dr.john.pharmd, and he's a great guy. He is the owner and operator of Robinson Drug and Compounding Center, and he is a fantastic functional medicine provider. John's got a beautiful approach to health, lots of lifestyle rolled into with some really deep knowledge. It's a great conversation. I've had the pleasure of getting to know John a bit over the last couple of months. He's a riot. He's really fun, very entertaining. You've got to follow him on Instagram. He's got a beautiful delivery of sometimes really complex information. So to find him, like I said, Instagram, dr.john.pharmd. He's with Robinson Drug and Compounding Center, and all his contact information will be in the show notes. Thanks so much for being here. Totally appreciate you guys. If you're listening to this on iTunes, you'll be hearing from one of our sponsors next, and then we'll get right into that episode. If you get value from this episode, make sure that you share it with your friends and your networks. And if you're feeling inspired today, make sure to leave us a review. Enjoy.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider.
Well, Dr. John Kim, it's been a long time coming. I am so happy to welcome you to the podcast.
Natalie, thank you so much. I know we've been going back and forth trying to reschedule this, but I'm so excited to be on your show. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, no, for you guys who are listening, I think we booked and canceled 3 or 4 different podcasts.
Four times. Yeah, we both had conflict of scheduling issues. You were traveling, I was traveling, and then I was just like, all right, we got this date, we get it done.
Yeah, John's last words to me before we got this together was, if this doesn't work, I'm getting on a plane and I'm flying down. We're doing this in person. It's gonna happen. Anyway, I'm super excited about this. And so John, we always start the podcast really and with a bit of the personal background of my guest. And I find that works really well. Why? Because very often your background is a big part of the reason why you do what you do and how you do it. So let's get rolling, because I'm so stoked about our topic today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a very unique background and as well as unique path that I've taken in my career and my overall health as well. So my name is Dr. John Kim. I'm a functional medicine pharmacist. Nice. So I know that doesn't really fit in terms of the root cause medicine and looking at pharmaceuticals, but really the healthcare is shifting right now in terms of looking at wellness is a different picture rather than just dispensing medications. So I've been a functional medicine pharmacist for the last 15 years. I practice out of New Jersey. And it's been really interesting how people are getting much more riled up about wellness and taking charge of their overall health. And I think that's a great way to get overall autonomy about your healthcare, because right now you're not practicing really healthcare, you're dealing with more sick care than anything else. So I like to empower patients and as well as my followers out there, because I am pretty busy on Instagram and talking about health optimization to begin with. And this is a great way to join Natalie today and talking about what we could talk about, especially mitochondrial optimization, cell danger response, and potentially hormone therapy as well.
Yeah, no, and even we'll probably dip into a little bit of peptides, just because I know you've got really good knowledge in that area, and we kind of agree on a couple of fundamental points around peptides that I think will be fun to touch on, because
absolutely.
All right, so let's get into this. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so well, interesting is that why I got into functional medicine should be discussed. So the reason I got into functional medicine early on, right out of pharmacy school, was because I was actually taking a emergency medicine rotation, and I saw one patient coming into the ER with an uncontrolled blood pressure coming in every week. And this was a 5-week rotation. I basically saw her 5 times. And I'm just like, why? Same person, 5 times, uncontrolled blood pressure. And we always end up having to looking at medication optimization and how do we actually get this patient out of the hospital quickly, because that overall affects the rating of the hospital and then the rating for the Medicare. So these are things that I saw early on. I'm like, this is completely broken. This is not the way that we should be handling it, because at that point in time, there was something called the JNC7. It's a blood pressure, high blood pressure guideline in terms of what we could use to treat these patients. One of the key points that is made within that guide is to do lifestyle change, eating well, exercising, etc. Because in itself, when you lose 10 pounds, you could lower your blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, by 10 points.
Yeah.
This is already talked about in pharmacy school, let alone even medical school. But us healthcare professionals are so busy optimizing medicine instead of optimizing a person's health. So I'm like, this cannot last. This is a broken part. And I also believe that in terms of how I grew up, I'm a Korean American. I was born in South Korea. And one of the key things I observed when I was growing up was that my grandparents were so busy pushing me about eating kimchi and proper diet, and as well as raw diet especially, that I didn't really like it. But looking back, I mean, that really changed the impact in terms of how I look at myself, health, and overall life. And so it does really come into play in terms of the culture, the culture of health right now in the United States. I'm questioning it happens in Canada as well, is completely broken, because it's run by the big pharma, and as well as the higher powers that be that likes to control the overall autonomy of a person's health, that people are not getting better. Instead, they're getting sicker.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's so true. So you went to pharmacy school, you see this woman coming in and out of the hospital on your emergency ER rotation 5 times. Funny, my mom for a while had blood pressure that they couldn't, and they just kept throwing more blood pressure medications at her and more diuretics. And she ended up so messed up because of course her electrolytes went off the charts. And you can imagine that's not going to help blood pressure either.
It's not. And then when you're talking about medication optimization, well, it's going to destroy your overall your nutritional panel as well. So you're taking for certain blood pressure medications, especially beta blockers, it can actually lower your CoQ10 along with the B complex. And what do you need CoQ10 for? Well, it helps to affect your mitochondria in a positive way. But the problem is when you are low in CoQ10, you actually make the body worse. Yeah. So what are you trying to fix? Nothing. But then we don't talk about this matter on a bigger picture, that the chronic issues a patient might be having doesn't happen to be one. You happen to be having to have 2, 3, or 4 because of the endless damage you're actually causing because of medication. So just recently, I just posted something on my Instagram talking about certain drugs that can actually damage your mitochondrial function. Well, beta block is one. Wow. Metformin. I know metformin is a big thing with the overall biohacking world, but especially metformin, it can actually deplete your CoQ10, disrupt your microbiome, B complex, vitamin D level, and magnesium as well, along with zinc. So all these micronutrients that you need to help to optimize your body function along with the mitochondria, you're not really doing anything instead of actually damaging it. So you have to look at pharmaceuticals a lot differently. And so one thing I mentioned to my followers is that friends don't let friends take drugs.
I love that.
Okay, so
and you're not talking necessarily about recreational drugs here. You're talking about pharmaceutical drugs.
Pharmaceutical drugs, right? You can talk about marijuana or psychedelic mushrooms or something like that.
Yeah, that's another episode.
That's a whole episode.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about that. You're talking about pharmaceutical drugs. If we could optimize a person's health by helping to eat better, poop better, sleep better, and really looking at lifestyle a lot differently, and as was de-stressing. Those are easy things to do. It doesn't cost you much, but this is never talked about because it's not cool. It's not some fancy machine that we could end up having to use to optimize our health, because you have to talk about that is the foundation of our health, but it's not really talked about.
Yeah, I refer to it as, getting the terrain ready to receive. You prepare the terrain. You got to create, it's like planting vegetables. If you don't have good soil, nothing's going to grow, or it's going to look kind of wonky and it's not going to be that good for you. So Okay, so our chosen topic really was mitochondrial optimization and cell danger response. But before we get to that, because there's a reason why you chose this topic, and there's a reason why you being a pharmacist, you then moved into the functional medicine space, which, it's funny, like all the pharmacists I've come across are some of the smartest people that I know. And
Oh, thank you.
But it's because you guys understand things at a much deeper level. You understand the biochemistry of the body and the cell much more deeply in some ways than even a lot of medical doctors, right? And I think there's groups of medical doctors now that are definitely digging into that topic, but you guys that's what you grew up on. That's your foundation. And so what is it that took you from just being a guy, dispensing pills in a drugstore to being the guy that's actually solving problems for people, quite apart from probably getting really frustrated counting pills and thinking, this is not what this person needs. This is not what this person needs.
Yeah, no. That's a great story that I could tell you about is that, one thing that patient made a big impact, but I also wanted to know, how do I optimize a person's health?
Mm-hmm.
So I had good mentors where they actually dragged me to do a fellowship in functional medicine. So right out of pharmacy school, instead of just going to straight retail and doing that, I actually took 2 years of time to really get trained in functional medicine, looking at the root cause medicine differently.
Nice.
And so that really helped out to set in the soil, if you want to call it, or the foundation. And after that, I had a lot of good practitioners that I followed around and really learning from it. But one of the big impact that actually happened to me was back in 2015, when I actually had a heart attack at the age of 33.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's something that hard to discuss, but that in itself really made an impact because I look at health a lot differently, as well as root cause medicine much bigger. Because what happened was, yes, I had a heart attack. I had an 85% blockage of my LAD, or the lower anterior descending artery, which is called the widowmaker.
Yeah.
And one of the things that actually happened to me, because I wanted to know why I actually had a heart attack, right?
Yeah.
Everybody be like, oh, you had a heart attack. Okay, get you on beta blockers. Let's get your cholesterol lower. But I wanted to know what caused it, because I was very healthy. I mean, I think I look at health much differently at this point in time. But I was very fit. I had a clean blood work, but I ended up having to have a heart attack. So my doctor that I was working with, she was very, very smart enough to looking at, did you have Lyme disease before? I'm like, well, I don't think so. But she's like, well, let's get you tested. So that test results took about a month and a half, but I got back, but I was actually positive for bartonella infection, along with mycotoxin, Epstein-Barr, and mycoplasma.
Oh, you sure know how to stack toxins, don't you?
Oh yeah, so I love it, just love it. And you talk about heavy metal on top of that, right? And then, so these are things that I never knew I actually had it, but obviously I had it, which caused a lot of issues. I had digestion problem, I had acne all over my face, I'm very fatigued, can't sleep that long, and everything that I was eating was reacting in my body. So she was smart enough to look at these things a lot bigger, and she also concluded that it's basically undiagnosed Bartonella infection probably end up having to trigger this, because Bartonella infection, which is called a cat scratch fever, can actually damage the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, which can actually increase inflammatory process and result in an atherosclerotic plaque to be built up a lot faster, right?
Right, because your body's trying to repair the damage on the endothelium, right?
Yeah,
basically. So it's a repair mechanism.
Repair mechanism, right? The body's ways to heal that issue. But in many cases, the body's not healing properly, and you have a lot of issues, which is going to kind of go into play into the healing process and cell danger response right after this. But that's what happened. It took me about 2 years to get rid of that. But one of the things I would like to at least tell your audience is that I didn't use any antibiotics at all.
Wow.
At all. I used, she put me on lipid therapy to stabilize the cellular membrane, as well as to help to detox. And when you're utilizing phospholipids, especially phosphatidylcholine, as actually anti-inflammatory. So that actually helped to resolve a lot of the intravascular inflammation, biofilms, and infectious burden that I already was having. So I used a company called Body Bio. They actually use, they make a liposomal phosphatidylcholine.
Yeah.
And that really helped to stabilize the cellular membrane damage that I already incurred from the infection, but also helped me recover and getting me through that entire process. And I'm telling you, for 6 months straight, I was getting so sick, because what happens with the PC and phospholipid therapy is that it actually literally turns your cell inside and out. So all that toxin, infections, chemical burns, all that's going to be dumped out. And so you get worse before you get better.
Yeah.
But if I show you a before and after picture, I wish I could show all your audience about this. My face completely cleared. Okay. My digestion was getting better. I was not getting reactive to all the food. At the same time, I was able to get the bartonella infection cleared out. It took me about additional year and a half, but it was a slow process I was able to clear out. And I do get my blood level checked every year. I'm still bartonella free.
Wow.
So people, I mentioned that, bartonella, once you have these type of infections lifelong, it is not. As long as you actually have the right treatment protocol and getting through and really concentrating on cellular lipids, and as well as the mitochondrial function, the body is able to regain and fix itself.
I love that. I love anything that enables the body to do its thing. I'm all for that. So maybe just for the listeners who are less technical, maybe you can explain a little bit about why is the cellular membrane so important? Like, people think of it maybe as an envelope around the cell holding all the stuff in, but it is, many people, certainly when I went to school, they talked about it as being the brain of the cell. People think, the nucleus and the DNA, and obviously everything is critical, but the membrane plays a very special role. And maybe if you wouldn't mind providing a brief explanation of what the membrane, why it's so important and why this is so critical, and what do the phospholipids do for that membrane?
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's make it simple as possible, because it does get really complex.
Oh yeah, no, let's not do a, level 3 class here.
No, level 3 or talking about the Krebs cycle and
no Krebs. I think I took a whole course on Krebs and I still am pretty shaky on it. So.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we always understand it as producing ATP, but really tone it down to the electron transport chain, right?
Yeah.
If you think about that particular aspect of an electron transport chain, it is made of 2 phospholipid layers, what's called a biphasic layer. So you actually have the lipid level and then the overall aqueous layer. They end up having to come into play. But that electron transport chain and the phospholipid groups, they end up having to dictate what's going in and what's going out. And that come into play in terms of letting ATP out and letting ATP in terms of nutrients. And the entire process of that is heavily dependent on some of the nutrients like L-carnitine, CoQ10, as well as D-ribose being the backbone of the ADP and ATP production, right? So you need all those nutrients to actually help to manage your entire cell membrane, or if you want to call it your entire body. Okay. And then you talk about the mitochondria. Within the cell, mitochondria takes about 25% of that space. And we think also that what we learn especially is about producing ATP by the mitochondria. But I'm here today to tell you that the mitochondria is actually the brain of the cell in itself, a sensor, a defender of the cell in itself, that when you actually have chronic issues, you don't just look at the overall issue that you have in your hand, but looking at turning it and looking at the overall mitochondrial dysfunction that's going on. And that's the reason why when you have a mitochondrial dysfunction going on, the lipids are coming to play to help to protect the cell.
Yeah.
Also end up having to function in an abnormal way, that body start to pump out additional phospholipids and making the cell membrane, which is supposed to be pliable and letting things to go in and out, what's going to cause a lockdown measure. Okay. And then keeping all that toxin in. And that's the reason why I mentioned before about how PC or phospholipid therapy can actually turn that cell inside out. Well, utilizing phospholipid therapy, it can actually make that cellular membrane to be pliable.
Yeah.
And work in the biofilms when you actually have a chronic infection, maybe, but also helps to act as a anti-inflammatory and helps to detox. And that's why it's so important that you actually have a healthy levels of fat in your diet to help to support that as well. And one of the key things that I've seen, it's just my observation, I wish there's more studies about this, that vegans actually has the worst health outcome because they don't have the necessary fatty acids to support the cellular membrane.
Right. And so here we're talking about very specific fats, and these are animal sourced, the right animal sourced omega-3s and what have you, that your cell needs to function properly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And omega-6 and omega-3, those needs to be addressed as well. There's such a bad connotation about omega-6 as being inflammatory, which can be true, but you also need a right ratio between omega-6 and omega-3. Normally it should be 4:1.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the healthy. So 4 parts of omega-6 and 1 part of omega-3.
Yeah.
Taking too much omega-3 can actually cause immunosuppression as well. So you got to have the right balance of the phospholipids. The thing is, we don't look at this in a bigger way that, hey, take a 12 grams of omega-3 to help deal with your rheumatoid issues. What are you doing? You're already suppressing the immune system even more.
Yeah.
Patients don't get better. So again, you got to look at the phospholipids and the entire fatty acid cycle a lot bigger. And that's really the entire structure of the cellular membrane is fat.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's all about the fat and the right fat in the right place at the right time. So what are your thoughts on, before we keep going on the whole mitochondrial cell danger response, mitochondrial optimization, what are your thoughts on supplementing with omega-3? Like, this is a very controversial issue. There are a lot of people out there right now that are very, very cautionary, if not stronger than that, against omega-3 supplementation versus, and actually there was a study I just heard about recently. You know what? I shouldn't even mention it because I can't remember. I don't remember the study or what they were saying. But all I know is that it was definitely shining a very ugly light on omega-3 supplements.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously in a best case scenario, we're eating wild caught fish, little ones, that don't bioaccumulate too much mercury or whatnot, which of course, there's also people who say if the fish has more selenium in it than mercury, that's going to correct for the mercury anyway, because selenium is protective.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's go back to the first question. What are your thoughts on omega-3 supplementation?
Well, even before we talk about omega-3, we have to talk about how to get rid of the bad fats.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Oxidized fats coming from seed oils. No canola, no corn oil, no vegetable oil, especially margarine. I still remember growing up.
I can't believe they even make margarine anymore.
I know they still do. And especially like when you go to, what was that? I remember years ago when Fabio was on TV, it's like, I cannot believe it was butter. Yeah.
Oh my God. Remember that? That was awful.
It was horrible, but those are inflammatory, right? So I remember, growing up, I mean, I slathered margarine all over my bagel and eating that. I'm just looking at like, oh my God, what kind of shitty damage I was doing to my body looking at it.
But you were loading up that plaque.
Yeah, especially and on top of I didn't know I had a bartonella infection. So here you go. That there's lifestyle and infection. There you go.
Perfect storm. Yeah.
Perfect storm. So again, you got to clean up your entire pantry. If you actually have any of these type of bad oils, you want to get rid of that. Right? Stick with the healthier oil. Ghee butter, great to support your overall gut because it contains butyrate. You have vitamin K, vitamin A, all those things that's going to be really helpful for you. And then if you're going to fry food, you're going to use oil that's a lot more stable in that sense of that. Avocado oil is great, right? As well as coconut oil.
Well, ghee's pretty good for cooking at high heat because it doesn't burn, right?
It doesn't burn.
It's quite stable. Then you get what are your thoughts then on lard and like tallow? Like
I love those.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when they're well sourced, I think they're pretty good.
As long as you get a clean source, grass-fed tallow source, I mean, that's one way to do it. I know tallow could be used for many things in terms of skincare, but
beauty, I know.
Beauty, yeah, absolutely. So that's where I would start with omega-3 discussion. You got to pick the right fat and try to decrease that. But especially when you have an oxidized fat that can accumulate within your adipose tissue for a long period of time. So you need to get that out as quick as you can by utilizing correct phospholipids like PC therapy, again, the company I recommend is going with Body Bio.
Mhm.
And it's not just PC, you also need a bioactive oil as well. So that particular company makes balanced oil. So I would do 1-to-1 ratio, mixing that together, because if you think about the cellular membrane, like I discussed before, is biphasic. You're looking at the fatty layer and as well as the aqueous layer that you need to support. So that makes really sense, along with replacing the minerals that you need, because the electron transport chain is heavily dependent on a corrective manner of minerals. And we don't get enough minerals these days because we're so busy drinking water and sweating. That's what we recommend doing, but not replacing the essential minerals they're looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where we start. Now, in terms of the omega-3, again, is the right balance of the omega-3 along with omega-6 is what should be done. And too much of the good thing that is being promoted about is not the best way to do it, because I mentioned before that it can be immunosuppressive, that you need to actually have the right omega-3 is in coming from the food. I'd rather have patients go and get a wild-caught salmon. Those are the good ways to kind of replace that. There are certainly plant source available as well, but also if you get a good grass-fed beef, for instance, it does contain high amounts of ALA and omega-3 to begin with. So you got to see the source and where you get it. And I think food becomes a lot more bioavailable to begin with, rather than just sticking with the supplements.
Yeah. So when you talk about plant-based omega-3, you're talking about algae?
Algae.
Yeah. Okay. Because I do want to, I think that, again, there's another big myth or a big thing out there. I had a client the other day tell me, yeah, I eat lots of seeds. I eat lots of pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds. And this guy's got a lot of issues. Yes. And I'm like, you need to be mindful of the fact that those seeds are very high in omega-6.
Omega-6
and again, I mean, not to demonize omega-6, we will die without omega-6. But when you're over depending on these things, and then people get told, yeah, but with hemp and this and that, I'm going to convert into omega-3. And it's like, well, yeah, if you're lucky, 2 to 3% conversion, like it's not going to be enough. It's not going to do it for you. So, okay. So algae, omega-3.
Hemp is great. I know some of the companies are now making hemp oil, just straight hemp oil, that are 4-to-1 ratio as well.
Oh, they are? Interesting.
Yes. I've seen companies
they've done the work.
Yeah, they've done that. So there are things available. And hemp, I like hemp anyway. I know Canada, you can't get hemp, right?
Yeah, we can.
Or at least you can? Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, we can get hemp. We got all the things. You can't bring it in. Just like you can't bring it to the States. I mean, everybody's getting all crazy. They're like, yeah, it's legal here and it's legal there, but you can't get it from here to there.
So
I don't know.
Backwards.
Anyway, you know what? We'll end up on another rant, and we've already been on 3 rants together before the podcast. So we're going to stay away from that. So let's get back to mitochondrial optimization, cell danger response. So we have our cell membrane. It's gotten stiff. It's not working properly. In a way, what the body also does is it sequesters toxins. Like that's one of the things that the human body does, is to protect us. So now you've got a cell that's kind of stuck. The mitochondria is not working properly, so it's not making enough energy. It's stuck and it's full of crap. It's full of the things that you don't want. Now what?
So
now what? Well, now what do we do?
So one thing that audience should really realize is that mitochondria is very susceptible. It's very sensitive, right, to nutritional deficiency, along with environmental toxins and oxidative damages. That oxidative damage could be coming from medications, especially taking statin drugs. It actually increases oxidative damage because your CoQ10 level gets depleted. Yeah. So you have to look at entire picture of your mitochondrial function, even before we could talk about the cellular danger response, because medications alone can actually cause mitochondrial damage as well. You're talking about acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, which is commonly taken. It depletes glutathione, which can in turn affect the Krebs cycle and detox pathway at the same time. And then you're talking about some of the ADD medications that a lot of kids are on these days, amphetamines, Adderall, all those are coming to play. You're talking about NSAIDs. So these are all the common drugs. Metformin could be aspirin, azathioprine, and then you're talking about what else is there? well, if you're doing recreational drug like cocaine, that also affects the mitochondria.
Yeah, okay, we're not going to go there.
No, we're not going to go there. We can go into tangents.
It's bad for so many things. So
it's bad. So you got to look at these things in a bigger matter. That medication becomes a humongous point that you have to look at, right? And so that's where they end up having to go into play. So going into a cell danger response, right? Mitochondrial dysfunction is a real thing. So in terms of the chronic illnesses that people are going through, especially dementia, early aging, you talk about autism, you talk about bipolar disorder, ataxia, neuropathic pain especially, those are all related to mitochondrial dysfunction, is because of the cell in itself is sensing some type of stress, toxin, infection, and such, and trauma. Okay, so good example is when you end up having to have a cut, for especially in your skin, right? You actually cause that thing called cell danger response to occur because the mitochondria already detects that, hey, there's a cut, there's a damage within the cell. It's going to drive the inflammatory aspect to come into play. And that's a normal response for a body to come into healing. And as well as there's a certain phase of the body and body's healing cycle to actually help to increase granuloma and then fibrosis and increasing cellular production. And that's a proliferative phase. And then when you go into a healing cycle, when you let the cut heal properly, then your cell's completely fine and you don't have any scar issue. But let's just say you start to pick on that. It's going to cause scarring problem. And that's where the overall de-differentiation of the overall healing cycle occurs, where the cell in itself is stuck in a damage mode, resulted in other conditions where you see mitochondrial dysfunction. Right. So that's one of the things we could talk about the cell danger response and a healing cycle, but is all those processes I'm talking about right now is controlled by the mitochondria.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a healthy mitochondrial function, those all healing cycle is going to get worse.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to look at this in a bigger matter. So let's go back to the cell danger response and what that is. So when a cell is detecting some type of toxin or certain damage that occurs and certain danger per se, the mitochondria is basically the brain of that particular cell to detect that there's a certain threat. So the mitochondria end up having to cause something called a depolarization. So it basically sends a signal within the cell to say that, hey, there's a danger going on. Now what we're going to do is going to pump out inflammatory fatty acids and then trying to really lock in that damage within that particular cell, because you don't want that damaging thing to going all over the place. So the mitochondria is there to really cave that off by increasing phospholipid production. Okay. And so it caves that cell in. So when you have a toxin, for instance, it's not spreading everywhere. So it's like heavy metal, for instance, right? And then you actually have increasing reactive oxygen species. And also when mitochondria normally is supposed to produce ATP, well, it stops the production of ATP. Instead, it actually floods the ATP out of the cell to cause phagocytes and as well as T killer cells to come into play to really fix that, or at least to contain it. Then you actually have the entire process sending that cell danger response into the brain, into the cellular central nervous system. And then you have the sickness behavior, and then you have the entire healing cycle to come into play. So I hope it didn't really make it too complex for the audiences, but one of the things is that you need a healthy amount of phospholipids, you need a healthy amount of inflammatory effect and the mitochondrial function in order for you to go through this entire process in a normal way. Right. If you don't, that's when you end up having to have chronic issues come into play later on. Or
when you have an overwhelm of too much toxin, like in these infections, like whether it's Lyme or Bartonella or mold or heavy metals, when the system is overwhelmed and you have too many of these cells that have shut down, it overwhelms the body's ability to go through a proper healing. It's a little bit like what you were talking about with the cut. It's a normal process and it'll resolve and then you're done.
Yeah.
Right. But you get these infections and it overwhelms the system.
Huge. So now, and if you want to give a perfect example, look at the acute respiratory distress that's resulted from COVID infection.
Yeah.
Right. So there's 3 phases of the healing cycle we could talk about. You have a CDR1, CDR2, and CDR3. CDR1 is that called a containment and innate immunity response that you need. So when you have an infection, for instance, right, the mitochondria going through that entire healing cycle of CDR1 helps to increase apoptosis along with necrosis and phagocytosis, but increase the metabolic aspect they want to try to contain. The problem is, if you look at COVID-19 infection, for instance, that entire process of phagocytosis and apoptosis go to haywire.
Yeah.
It's not able to contain that. And so the patients are resulted in getting into the ICU. They actually have acute respiratory distress and all the damages, including organ damage that occurs from a COVID-19. So certain patients, when they're not able to have a healthy immune response, they get stuck in that healing process of CDR1.
Right.
And we see it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. And then once the healing cycle of that CDR1 response is done, the body goes into something called the CDR2. I mentioned before how when you have a cut, the cell starts to proliferate and starts to get the tissues come into play. Well, that's one of the response that is able to help to proliferate that particular cell to contain the damage and going through that healing cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm-hmm.
once that healing cycle is somewhat done, the body now goes into something called the CDR3, help to differentiate and also help to develop a healthier cell. The problem is that when you don't have a safe and as well as a healthy differentiation process, that is when you end up having to have chronic illnesses that come into play years later, such as autoimmune issue, excitotoxicity. You talk about neurological or neuropathic pain, psychiatric symptoms, PTSD as well. Mm-hmm. Just because you've gone through some kind of trauma, that trauma is not going to be causing PTSD right in that moment. No, it actually, your body goes through the entire healing cycle. And that's later on when the healing cycle did not go through properly, resulted in PTSD to be developed.
So it's almost like you get stuck. The body gets stuck instead of continuing through the cycle. It gets stuck somewhere, like in the CDR1.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's. I mean, it's very complex to process to even describe it. I hope I'm doing a good job.
Yeah. No, you're doing all right. I just had a question. So you talked earlier about the cell danger response triggering a process in the brain that I guess because the people that I've come across who have been told that they've kind of got this cell danger response thing going on in their system for any number of reasons, they have other issues, like they have a mental issue tied into this. And so what you're saying is basically that this cell danger response releases, I'm guessing, cytokines or inflammatory, whatever it is, messengers that message the brain that says, we're in trouble, we've got a problem. And these people also get stuck kind of in a sympathetic mode, basically.
Huge. And that's where the body's normal response to go through, because it's sensing a danger. And so that's when the mitochondria goes into this entire defense mode. And the mitochondria is not able to function properly, and you cannot deprogram that when you're dealing with chronic illness. Many instances that mitochondria is having a dysfunction resulted in all these issues that we see in a chronic illness. Right. Autoimmune didn't occur just because you had a gluten, right? It actually happened to be that the gluten ended up having to cause a inflammatory issue within your gut, resulted in other things such as LPS, lipoprotein saccharides, to come into play, causing additional microinflammation, blah, blah, blah. Down the line, resulting in a Th1 and Th2 imbalance. All that process is part of the healing cycle, and how the mitochondria was trying to contain that problem, but it has gone through a differential phase, was not in a not normal way, resulting in all this chronic problem. Right. So why this is so important is that all wrapped in. I mean, we could understand the complexity of it. And you want to look at the overall original study, I would highly recommend all the audiences to look at Dr. Robert Novier's work. He's a pioneer looking at the mitochondrial damage and as well as looking at the entire cell danger response and healing cycle. He's the pioneer who published this particular studies back in 2014. And now is the time that we're really looking at this in a functional world. A little too late, because we've always been, and this is the issue that I see with functional medicine, is that we're so busy running labs. That's fine. But when you see a deficiency, when you see a leaky gut issues, when you see autoimmune response going on, including heavy metal toxicity, all these things are resulted from a mitochondrial dysfunction that was occurring because of the overall root problem that we have not really looked into, which could be some of the chronic infections like Lyme disease, bartonella, mycotoxins, including parasites, right? And then you're also looking at particular mental or physical trauma that actually occurred, right? And as well as all the other issues that come into play, including poor eating habits, lifestyle. All these are all factored in terms of how the mitochondria goes into a dysfunction mode, that just because you've tried to fix a low vitamin D level or low B6 level, you're not going to fix the problem. And so I'm not a big fan these days just running nutritional pedal and thinking that that's going to be the problem, that's going to fix the issue. Because what I see all the time is that, and they happen to go to multiple doctors and patients are sick and tired of it, but that hasn't really fixed the problem. So what have you achieved? They go into this entire cycle of going to one doctor, not getting fixed. Oh, well, I saw some response, but not full response. And then resulted in all this issue that goes into play. Just give you an example about autoimmunity. Just because you just develop Hashimoto does not mean that you're not going to develop other autoimmune issues, such as rheumatoid.
Yeah, no, I actually think there's a link, right? I mean, once you've developed one, you have a much higher likelihood of continuing to develop them.
And that's the entire picture of a healing cycle that people are not going through properly. And so, lifestyle, including changing your diet, all those things can actually change the gene expression. We've seen that in studies. I'm not saying not to do that, but we have to look at a bigger matter and really focus on what is a root cause issue, okay? And look at these things and be comfortable talking about it rather than trying to say, hey, I have the fixer upper that you could actually use by just taking vitamin D. The vitamin D deficiency occurred because of X, Y, and Z occurring, especially mycotoxin.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. But we talked about vitamin D. You have some really interesting information on vitamin D, the causes for low vitamin D in some cases and how to fix it, and why not to just keep taking vitamin D and how it can, on the other side, drive autoimmunity. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how does mycotoxin interact with vitamin D? So
mycotoxin, for instance, I don't know how that is up in Canada, but especially down in Florida or warmer climates, and sometimes if you end up having to live in a very damp area, you're a lot more risk of actually getting exposed to some of the toxic mold. So there is a term, I think it was the early 70s, talked about the sick building disease, and that's a real thing. And so if you actually have mold growth in your home or something on that line, you have to fix that. We got to move out of that place. It's very hard to contain and fix it. And I've gone through that as well. Especially last year, I end up having to get exposed to black mold inside my building. And so I'm still trying to get rid of that at this point.
Wow.
Right? It's a problem. It causes a lot of downstream cytokine activity and sickness. So why this is so important is that mycotoxin and having mold, it can actually cause a blockade of the vitamin D receptor. Resulting in, if you take a vitamin D, for instance, it's supposed to convert to the active, right? 25 or 125 hydroxy. The problem is that when you're taking a vitamin D in existence of some type of chronic illness, such as mycotoxin, the mycotoxin at that mold is going to block that vitamin D. And so even though you might be taking that 5,000 units of vitamin D or 10,000 units or 50,000 units that the doctor recommending, it's not going to go up. It happened to be such that I end up having to go through that. And so, I start to look at that in a bigger way, that you have to get the mold issue even before trying to tackle the vitamin D. And if you actually have a low vitamin D level, and as well as having a calcitriol level increasing, that can result in a immunosuppression. So it's not good at all. So again, vitamin D level being low is the overall end result
Of something.
Something.
Yeah.
Lyme disease could be mold, could be parasites as well. So you have to look at it in a bigger way. All those things are bacteria, viruses, all those are part of our overall ecobiome or microbiome world,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're supposed to live in a healthier balance. I think the biggest issue that we see is that our world has been so sterile that we're not able to interact with these microbiomes that well.
The microbes. Yeah.
Microbes.
So actually, let's take one step back, and then I guess there's one more thing. But so we talked about the cell danger response and how miserable it is. So what do people do about that? How do you, because we've just presented people with this horrible problem, and people might be listening to this nodding, going, yeah, that's me. Yeah. And we haven't given them any solutions.
Yeah. So. They're like, oh shit. Like, I know I have a problem. Like, what do I do? Like, I'm just stuck with this. No, you have to look at the root cause issue. So, try to find a functional medicine doctor or functional practitioners who are able to understand the cell danger response and look at a root cause medicine. Mm-hmm. Not talking about root cause in terms of you have a nutritional deficiency, root cause in terms of looking at some of the infection, some of the toxin, some of the cell danger response that's going on in a bigger way. I think those are, there are a lot of people that are now understanding it, but mm-hmm. not so much in terms of tackling all those people who are suffering the issue. Okay?
Yeah.
So, I was very fortunate. It's God's blessing that I'm able to work with a physician to help me direct and learning a lot, and now I'm able to help other patients. Mm-hmm. But we have to look at this in a better way. That we got to dig deeper. Let's look at proper testing. Right? I'm all about testing, but look at the proper testing to see if you're dealing with mycotoxin, bartonella, or some other infection that might be causing it. And you have to look at the right company. Just going to LabQuest or LabCorp is not going to be the trick. There are specialty tests available. Another testing company that I do recommend these days is to work with a company called IGL. They're based out of Germany. They do a epigenetic testing. And that epigenetic testing really breaks down in terms of the mitochondrial function in the cellular level, and along with some of the toxins and infections you might be looking at. Okay. It gets expensive, about $1,200. There are only a few doctors around the United States who understand that particular testing. But if you're able to get that IGL testing, it's going to be a game changer in terms of how you're looking at epigenetics, mitochondrial function very, very differently, and looking at the root cause issue deeper.
Right. And do they have a list? Is there on their website, would there be a listing of the doctors that do use the test? Like, how do people go about finding those doctors?
I don't think so. I haven't seen a list at all. I wish they could actually market this better in the United States. Again, I'm very fortunate that I'm able to do this test every year to looking at it. So
do you run the test for your patients?
I don't. I end up having to get the results from my physician, but work with the doctor.
Okay.
To work with I know it's because they're not willing to work with a pharmacist, right?
So they only will work with MDs.
MDs, and they're based out of Germany, so you got to have the right connection looking at these things much deeper. But I know Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, he does it, and some of the other functional doctors out there.
But if you can't get the IGL, there's got to be some tests in the US that are still okay. I mean, there are a number of companies that test for mycotoxins, EBV, Lyme, mold.
Great Plains. You have iGenix. You actually have Vibin America. All those are great companies so far. There's able to look at the root cause issue deeper. So again, proper testing, look at the root cause, and then also have the plans to take care of that.
Right. And so the phospholipids are a key piece of getting over the cell danger response, because that reestablishes that proper phospholipid layer.
Definitely. So that's the number one thing that I always recommend patients to take when you have a chronic issues like Lyme disease or mold.
Yeah.
So that's one. And the second thing is you have to look at the detox pathway very well. Now, there's a reason why you have detox problem. Well, let's try to fix that. Okay. You also have to look at the drainage pathway. Lymph also has to drain properly. So when you actually have a stuck, I mean, it's the same thing like a toilet. You're trying to flush a toilet, but if you're not able to have a proper plumbing matter established, you're going to actually have an overflow of crap that you're trying to push through the toilet.
Literally.
Literally. That's the same matter as a human body. When you're not able to poop properly, you're not sweating. If you're not able to detox properly, all those things are going to build up and blow up. And that's another reason why when you're dealing with Lyme disease or chronic infections of such, patients get worse and having all these die-off reactions, trying to fix that rather than trying to ease that detox pathway, lymph pathway to open up. And there has to be talked about much, much deeper.
For sure. And so what are your recommendations on lymph? I mean, pooping is basic, our pathways of elimination are, there's breath, there's sweat, there's urine, there's feces, obviously, but lymph, what are your recommendations on keeping the lymph moving?
Sure. Certain binders are great to use. I mean, there are, homeopathic drainage binders, and as well as, a company called Cellular. I know they're much more readily available these days.
I have some here.
Yep. They're great to work at. I know other companies that are having other homeopathics such as Beyond Balance or Body Bio. All those are great companies to work with to actually help to support the entire detox and drainage pathway. So, one of the things that I don't like to a lot of times talk about this is that I give all these informations to patients, but even on social media, but they're like, how do I get in contact with the doctor? Or how do I work to fix this? Because I've been going to different doctors and they don't know what they're doing, or I feel stuck. And so one thing I would suggest is all those companies I just mentioned before, just go to their website or reach out to them and then see if there's any local practitioners that you can work with. I do end up having to do a virtual consultation as well. So I'd be happy to coach people. But right now, there's too many people suffering that we don't have enough experts out there to look at this in a deeper way.
Absolutely. No, and it's funny you mentioned that because I thought, you call up Body Bio and say, okay, who are the docs? Who's out there that I can work with? Who you trust? So that's a really good solution. Actually, that's a good way to go about it because I definitely see that there's a big need. I mean, definitely there's a couple of there are doctors out there that are doing a great job, but there's not quite enough of them just yet. There's definitely a lot of people looking for answers. Okay. So, and actually, you mentioned a doctor earlier. I didn't catch his name. Was it Dr. Robert Novier?
Novier.
How do I spell his last name? Do you know?
Oh, goodness. It is N-O, V as in Victor, I-A-U-X as in Xavier. Robert is a first name.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So I just want to make sure I put that in the show notes so that people can look him up and look up his papers. He
has a big following within the autism world. I mean, he's one of the key editors for the Autism Society and looking at the cell danger response. So even autism alone, I mean, autism didn't occur because of vaccination or something on that line. It's a key piece in terms of why there's a cell danger response going on. And the healing process didn't go through properly, resulted in autism. So you have to look at.
Yeah. Could the vaccine have been the trigger, or are you saying there's no real evidence of that, or we're not really going to turn this into vaccines cause autism podcast?
No, we cannot. So, I mean, one of the things is that.
Or do you think it's just a simplistic view of looking at it?
If you just keep on saying that autism is caused by vaccine, that's a false notion because vaccine could be one of the picture because you're causing an immune response to occur, and as well as other chemical toxins such as formaldehyde, and I don't think they use thimerosal as much as anymore, but all those things are come into play. But the thing is, when you actually have a genetic predisposition and also healing cycle not coming to play properly, that could result in that, right?
I see.
But all those studies are looking at in terms of, autism and vaccines, they don't look at that picture fully, and so it is improper, and that's one of the things that they end up and say, autism is not caused by vaccines.
Right.
Which
So
can
they're
be
not
true.
going deep enough, is
It's
what you're
not.
saying, right? So
It's
it's,
not.
yeah, yeah,
So it's all cell danger response, all immune reaction that's occurring. Detox pathway is completely shot, and then all the other things that you end up having to talk about. So it is a perfect storm. All those
yeah,
can come into play, end up having to result in autoimmunity, autism, and all the other mitochondrial dysfunction.
yeah. So mind your mitochondria. It always comes down to the mitochondria, it seems.
Yeah. Actually,
Um,
before we touch that, one last thing I want to make, in terms of optimizing a child's health,
mhm,
is determined by the mother,
mhm.
right? The mitochondrial DNA has to be healthy in order to produce healthier offsprings. Has to start with the mother. We don't talk about that. All
Yeah.
those birth control pills that women are taking these days, right? Poor
Mhm.
diet, having PCOS, chronic issues, heavy bleeding, all those are resulted in mitochondrial dysfunction. And that can
Right.
actually result in mitochondrial DNA damage. And
Right.
you're having a child that are unhealthy, having allergic issues, all this problem that's coming to play. So you can't just say, hey, it's the vaccine. No, you also have to look at the mother. You also have to looking at the health of it, including the father as well. There was a study just looking at men taking metformin and having a
Yeah.
health issue within the offspring,
Yeah.
right?
I read about that.
That's all resulting in mitochondrial dysfunction. Again, bigger picture, we have to looking at these things in a bigger matter and have the courage to talk about these things, that, you know what, everybody has to be healthy. And I
Mhm.
always recommend as well, if the mother is planning on, or at least a family planning on having a child, it is not a bad idea to start to detox and looking at cellular membrane and mitochondrial function in a healthy manner. And you got to
Yeah.
be healthy to conceive,
Yeah.
but you also need to be healthy to have a healthy offspring.
Yeah. No, and you know what? That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've definitely known people who've taken months, if not a year, to try and get themselves optimized before. I mean, it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes things happen, but it's a huge argument, or I don't want to say argument, but it's a huge reason why it's never too early to start addressing these things and optimizing your health so that you're ready to go when it's time
Absolutely.
to start your family, if that's something that you want to do, quite apart
Yes.
from your own purposes. So we were going to touch on, and we're going to run short on time here. I think we're running low on time. So I know that should we close it off, or do we want to touch on at what point we bring peptides into the mix? Because there's definitely mitochondrial peptides out there. There's people who are saying, I'm just going to take a bunch of MOTS-c and I'm going to make my mitochondria better. And
yeah, but you know what? You could do lifestyle change as well in terms of exercising for 45 minutes, especially doing HIIT. It actually increases the number of expression of the mitochondria. Utilizing heat and cold therapy also helps with the mitochondria. So there are many ways you could hack it in helping the mitochondrial function, but you know, peptides is just a tool. It's not going to be a thing that's going to be using to get rid of the root cause problem. And that's the misunderstanding that come into play. You're still following a tool to get rid of the issue rather than trying to look at the root cause problem that you're looking at, right? So, you know, I think I mentioned to you about the analogy between, you know, a leaf and an entire trunk of the tree.
Yeah.
A problem is just a leaf. Just because you got rid of that entire leaf does not mean that you have gotten rid of the root cause problem within the trunk or within the root itself.
For sure. Well, yeah. And you even hear very often about people talking about, if the plant is healthy in the first place, it would be less susceptible to getting attacked by a lot of the different organisms that attack plants. And it's the same as people. Like, you know, there's some of us walking around who somehow have been unscathed in the last 2 years. Is it because we're fortunate enough to have a system that was able to cope better, or we just got lucky, or some combination of the two? Who knows? But definitely keeping your body in its healthiest state is going to put you in a better position.
Yes. And so I agree in a sense that we have to build our body's resiliency, right? And we have to fight off some of the infections or the dangers that come into play. It's all depending on how we take care of the body. And so exercising, pooping well, eating well, sleeping well, all those come into play to build that resiliency up. Because I think a little off topic about, but when you're in a zombie apocalypse, you don't want to be the first one to get eaten.
No, you don't want to be the first one to get eaten. I don't know. Yeah, that's going to take us past our deadline, so we're not going to keep talking about that. So, all right, Dr. John Kim, are there any parting words? If there were 3 things you could tell people to do right now that they should start, and we've covered off the sleeping, the pooping, the exercising, the getting outside. What's the next level after that? What's the next thing beyond that you think everybody should really be taking? Like, should everybody go out and get tested for mycotoxins and EBV and Lyme, or people who have major issues? What are you, if you had 3 things you could recommend to people to do, what would it be?
Parting words is that if you are dealing with a chronic illness, such as autoimmune disease and other things that I mentioned before about mitochondrial dysfunction, that you should work with a practitioner to look at a root cause issue. So proper testing is a must, and as was a plan to take care of that issue. So that should be number 1. And then 2 is clean up your entire pantry. Healthy eating process is a must. You need to exercise, you need to move well, and as well as de-stress. I think the de-stressing portion is not really talked about these days because we're such in a go, go, go mode.
Yeah.
And we're forgetting to really relax and having that reset moment. It's not a bad idea to really take a breather, go for a walk, spending time with your loved ones. Increasing that oxytocin is going to do a number of things for your body. So that's a key thing that we have to really look at, and having that connection.
I love
and
that.
then the last thing that I would really recommend is to love yourself. If you don't love yourself, you don't respect yourself, that could be a big problem to the healing process. And one of the things that I really learned nowadays, and I'm going through the entire therapy as well, working with a business coach and having a mindset coach, is that there was a lot of trauma that I ended up having to put in my life, and as well as a victim mind that was resulting in having causing a setback. Well, if you're talking about the healing response, and I talked about trauma, well, there's a lot of hidden trauma that you might not end up having to release, result in an illness. So healthy spiritual life is a must, right? I'm a born again Christian. I'm not here to push religion, but you need to have that some type of a spiritual health that you're looking for, as well as a body health and mind health.
Nice. Yeah. Well, that whole integration, right? We all live in the same house. We better get along.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim. Can you maybe tell people how they can find you and how to get in touch with you if they need more Dr. Kim in their life?
I wish, yeah. So if anyone out there listening and want to connect, I'm definitely busy on Instagram. My Instagram bio, my page is at dr.john, John.Pharm.D is Pharm.D, Pharm.D.
Yeah.
So make sure you connect that. And my website is drkimwellness.com, is drkimwellness.com.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, it's been a total pleasure today. Thank you so much. It was definitely worth the wait. And
it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. And I look forward to doing it again because, we had about 10 different topics we could have talked about. We just
so much.
Picked this one because I haven't touched on this before. So this has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate it.